how did white consciousness become real? That's a good question, isn't it? Now, before we address the question, we have to define what is meant by real. And in this case, real means to have an actual existence in the physical world. And so how did white consciousness go from an idea in the mind of the colonist to having a real existence as a fully functional consciousness within certain human bodies? That's what we're going to find out right now. And to do this, we're going to go into this book right here called Birth of a White Nation by Dr. Jacqueline Battalora. And so let's go in here and turn to page 39, where she writes this. In the decades following Bacon's rebellion, colonial Virginia lawmakers used law to constitute white people and to discipline all within the colony into an ideology of whiteness. When was Bacon's rebellion? It began in the year 1676. And what was one of the key events in this rebellion? Negroes and Europeans collaborating to cut off the Virginia government. And in this process, they burned down Jamestown. And you'll read many scholars who use this event as a turning point in the social relations within the early colonies. And they do this because of what Bacon's rebellion represented, which was people from different backgrounds finding common cause to disrupt the plans of the elite, which obviously the elite saw as very problematic. And so what Dr. Battalora is basically saying in this opening sentence is that after the rebellion, the Virginia lawmakers used the tool of law to shape the people into the society into accepting the ideology of whiteness. Now let's continue. In other words, the laws promoted a worldview that assumed the superiority of whiteness. And we're going to find out later about some of these laws they put into place to promote whiteness. But although there never has existed a natural superiority of whiteness, the colonial Europeans, they did have a superiority of culture, knowledge, and military power, of which they used for the purpose of domination. Now, could they have used that superiority for other causes? Of course they could have, but they decided to use it for domination. And truth be told, because they yielded superiority in these areas, they were able to make any assumptions that they wanted to make. And guess what? Nobody was going to do anything about it, right? Nobody. Which is why they were able to use these laws to promote the assumed superiority of whiteness. Now let's keep reading. It should be noted that there was no such broad-based evidence of any such mindset or ideology among rebellion in 1676. There is no evidence that European laborers conceived of themselves as rulers over their fellow African laborers. Instead, the evidence reveals that European and African laborers shared a common experience of labor and daily life, and friendship and joint ventures, including marriage, were neither uncommon nor met with hostility. The laws passed in Virginia following Bacon's rebellion were a creative enterprise that defined a distinct group with a degree of shared experience and a context that can be called white culture. Of course, whenever one group is rendered distinct and different, in this case special and superior, the metaphoric coin always has a flip side. And what does that mean? We're talking about polarity and duality, where one characteristic has a twofold nature and can only be understood within this dual nature. And so, for example, high has a polar opposite, which is what? Low. And one can only understand high when it's considered in its relation to low, right? And so when you're riding in an airplane and you look out the window, you can only get a sense of how high you are by understanding how low the land and the buildings are, right? In relation to where you are. And this perceived separation is what gives any meaning or value to the high or low position. And it's the same thing with superiority. For superiority to have any meaning at all, it has to be considered in its relationship to its polar opposite, which is inferiority. So for the elite to have rendered the white groups as superior, there must have been a flip side to the coin to give this sense of superiority any real value. Here we go. In this case, the flip side is the rendering of those excluded from the group as inferior and disposable. And that's the black group, who they created to become entangled in a dualistic drama with the whites. And so the whites used black inferiority to comprehend the meaning and the value of white superiority. Just like when you're in the plane, you comprehend the highness by looking down at the lowness, right? And it gives you the context. Now let's keep reading. The consequences of these extraordinary efforts in law were far-reaching, shaping ideology, constituting social structure, and constructing race. While Maryland lawmakers were the first to use the category white to reference a specific group of humanity, it is unlikely that most English and other European laborers within the colonies were impacted or terribly concerned about the invention when it first appeared in 1681. And like she said, that's talking about the lower level laborers, because the leisure class for sure understood where this white identity was heading. Women who the day before the enactment of 1681 were called English or freeborn found themselves the day after referenced as English or other whites in a law that continued to punish marriage to an enslaved African American man. There were no new rewards or punishments for those on whom the new label was imposed. In other words, the law created no consequences that were unique to the new category of humanity it had invented. This enactment alone is unlikely to have been successful in constructing whiteness, meaning just creating the white title alone without providing any real change would probably not have done much in giving birth to the white consciousness. Here we go. European colonists probably cared little about what lawmakers called them when the label came without meaningful consequences. Bacon's rebellion remained on everyone's mind, and so they didn't forget about the Negro and the European rising up to cut them off. So this is what they did to fix that problem. The answer to the problem, according to Edmund Morgan, was to separate dangerous free Europeans from dangerous enslaved Africans by a veneer of contempt. But the question remained, how do you create separation and contempt where none yet existed? And I can imagine them having thought long and hard on this question and pondering about it. While there can be little doubt that a concept of the English as separate and distinct from the Africans and native peoples existed among lawmakers, a concept of race had yet to be formulated, asserted, and digested. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Virginia's land-owning elite pushed for legislation that established different treatment for English and other whites than for Native Americans and those of African descent. These laws emerged in the decade following the rebellion and continued to build through the first quarter of the 18th century, creating consequences that were dramatically different for those labeled white from those labeled Negro, mulatto, or Indian. And with the exception of the whites, none of these groups were the one to initially label themselves any of these names. It was the European who tagged all these people like pet animals, right? Coming from the adoption center. And so they learned to accept these names that they were given. And so one of the marks of a free people is not accepting a label that was forced on them for the purpose of domination, right? And instead having a name that was created by the group itself. This has a vast degree of psychological importance. But back to the law. The white elite rigged the system in such a way that created negative consequences for all non-whites in the land. Here we go. The cumulative effect was a thorough reorganization of colonial society. This is the reshaping of the social order and establishing firm boundaries to be followed. The package of laws included the prohibition against setting enslaved persons of African descent free and a law that rendered free women of African descent tithable. And tithable means taxable. In colonial America, the men and the slaves were typically the ones that were taxable, and not the free women, who typically had a husband that they were dependent on who paid the taxes. But they rigged the law to make the free Negro woman have to pay taxes on her labor, which was more of an economic restraint and restriction on the Negro families, right? Here we go. These laws linked Africanness with the status of servitude. Now, what does it mean to link Africanness with the status of servitude? That means it combined the two in an attempt to closely relate them as much as possible. So when one saw anyone with any recognizable African ancestry, they would automatically associate servitude or a lower status with that person, right? That's how they're linking them together. Let's keep going. In contrast, parameters and conditions of European labor arrangements of limited time bond servitude were framed by contract law, which ensured a termination date extendable only for cause, even if cause was loosely interpreted. Another law imposed a prohibition against free men of African descent from holding public office. Yet another forbade non-Europeans to be owners of Christian bond laborers. Another excluded African men from the armed militia. Through such enactments, those of African descent who were established as free members of the colonial community were rendered inferior to both an indentured and non-indentured white person, since an indentured white man held the legal potential of future position in public office and the ability to own bond labor. Through such laws, free people of African descent began to be stripped of opportunity and resources. So these laws were aiding in the construction of two things at the same time. It was both shaping black and white consciousness and conditioning the society through the legal codes who was and who was not to have access to certain rights and privileges. And so you can imagine just how people in that society responded to such obvious targeted laws, right? And eventually one group would start to look down while the other group would start to look up. Let's keep going. The prohibition against manumission, or the freeing of an enslaved person of African descent, the exclusion of free men of African descent from holding public office, and the prohibition of a non-European from owning a Christian bond laborer promoted the message that Africanness was positioned below the newly invented group called whites. Here the institution of law is exposed as a tool of social reorganization, working to craft a new hierarchy. And I've told you before that all things are tools, and tools are meant for what? You use them to build, construct, shape, and craft things. Tools like the law, they're not naturally good or evil. It's how humans use these tools that places in either of these categories. And so they could have used the law for the benefit of the entire society, or they could have used the law for the benefit of themselves, which is what they did, right? And so in this process, they used the tool of law for the shaping of white consciousness, for its materialization into the human vehicle. Let's keep reading. The new society would be unlike anything that existed before. Virginia lawmakers enacted a prohibition against the beating or whipping of a Christian white servant while naked, without an order from a justice of the peace, and worked to render whiteness a special status deserving of due process before inflictions of humiliation associated with public nakedness and physical punishment. Law began to link white with a set of expectations of privileges denied to those outside its parameters. Now, remember how they linked black with servitude? Well, what would we expect them to link white with? Privilege, humanity, freedom, right? All these concepts. And whites understanding black servitude, that's what gave them an appreciation for white freedom and liberty, because those two go hand in hand, right? Think about it. Now understand this. Many people make the statement about America being a free country, and they can make that statement because they have other countries to compare it to, right? Which do not appear to be nearly as free as what we experience over here in America. Places like North Korea, for example, the people can't even leave that country or listen to any outside media, which is completely different from the experience that we have here in America. Now, if every country were exactly the same as America, then boasting about America being such a free country, it wouldn't mean anything, right? It wouldn't mean anything. But when you have a strong polarity, like we just talked about North Korea, countries like that exist, then you get a sense of how valuable freedom is, right? When you have that comparison. And this is similar to what the lawmakers were doing when they were constructing whiteness and using the tool of the law to construct Negro-ness to give whiteness something to compare and contrast with. Here we go. The laws that follow contributed to the larger message that white people are a special, more deserving group relative to those of African descent. You see that? That's what they were doing. Virginia lawmakers passed an enactment blocking a person of African descent from testifying against a white person, and another that prohibited free persons of African descent from possessing any weapon, including a club, gun, powder, or shot, and yet another that subjected a person of African descent to a public lashing for raising a hand against any white person. These laws combined to render persons of African descent all but completely defenseless, especially against violence inflicted by a white person. This is the debasing of the Negro and creating a black inferiority complex, while at the same time doing what? Getting the whites high off the superiority complex, right? They both go together. That's what we have to understand. And you have to understand both of these. If you don't, you can't understand either one of them. They both go together. And what happens is that people today, they're not willing to talk about either one of these topics honestly, right? They either want to deal with one and try to neglect the other. and they get way too emotionally out of control for people to have a legitimate conversation and understand what happened, right? But that's what we're doing, right? We're not getting all wild and crazy about it. We're thinking about it and using intellect to examine and analyze it, because we are pulling ourselves out of the pit. Let's keep going. Not only do these laws enforce a hierarchy that places white people at the top, but they render the lives of those of African descent less valuable than the most depraved and inhumane white person. You see that? That's what Theodore Allen talks about in The Invention of the White Race, Volume 2, where he talks about the characteristic of racial oppression is where the highest member of the oppressed group is still beneath the lowest member of the oppressing group, right? This is what Dr. Battalora is referring to right now. Here we go. Through law, free people of African descent were stripped of their status as free. No matter how loyal to the English crown, no matter how faithful to Christianity, no matter how valuable their contributions to the colonial community, free people of African descent for the first time faced severe restrictions, right? It didn't matter how much Jesus they had in their life. They were still going down into the dungeon. Let's keep reading. They were limited not only in their legal standing within the community, but also by the virtue of their very ability to preserve and protect their bodily integrity and that of their family. These laws exposed free people of African descent to physical harm and worked to exclude African men and African families from full patriarchal authority. As you may recall, under common law, the male head of household was assumed to represent the interest of the family and expected to provide materially and to protect all women, children, and other dependents within the household. But the ability of free men of African descent to protect their family members, much less themselves, was severely narrowed by Virginia lawmakers. At the same time, patriarchal authority for white men was expanding through anti-miscegenation law and through greater range over persons of African descent with little regard for civil or criminal punishment. The law that prohibited a free person of African descent from being in possession of a gun and gunpowder, and the law that stripped the ability of African servants to hold and raise livestock, viewed alongside the enactment that listed freedom dues owed to a limited term white laborer, helped to shed light on how material value was attached by law depending on one's status as white or not. Freedom dues provided to every white male included 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings in money or the equivalent in goods, and a gun worth at least 20 shillings. And to every woman servant, 15 bushels of corn, 40 shillings in money or the equivalent in goods. And so these little bitty freedom dues went to the European laborers at the end of their contract. And it was to give them a start in the physically free world that they were coming into. Now, Negroes, they didn't have to worry about any freedom dues. Why is that? Because they were supposed to be locked down in the basement for eternity, right? Which meant no freedom to receive any freedom dues whatsoever. Let's keep going. Taken as a whole, the laws gave European laborers little more materially than they had before they were white. What the laws did was dramatically lower the bottom of society through worse conditions and treatment of people of African descent, meaning they dug the pit deeper for the Negro to fall lower into. And so the lower class Europeans, they were in the pit too. But what the elite did was they dug a deeper spot in this pit, right? And they allocated a special spot for the Negro, which made the Europeans feel like they were high in the plane, looking down at the Negro who was on land. But the truth is, it was an illusion. That plane that they thought they were high on, it never really took off. Let's keep going. The significant change that the enactments brought about was that of white people being made better off, not so much more than they were prior to the rebellion, but rather in relation to those of African descent who were made far worse off. You hear that? Pay attention. White laborers were given little more than the authority to rule over their fellow laborers of African and Native American descent, on the premise that they shared a superior status with the elites, whiteness. And that's how they were able to make white consciousness real. They created an ideology that assumed from the very beginning that whiteness was to be superior, right, on the top. And they began passing all these laws to create these obvious polarities between all the whites and all the non-whites, right? They incentivized all these Europeans to buy into these ideas, which afterwards gave the white consciousness an expression through their human vehicle, where they began to interact from a white worldview within the society. And once it took root within that society, it began to replicate itself over and over with the continuing generations. And today it has evolved into what it has evolved into, right? By being shaped by the society and molded by the environment, right? And various other circumstances. And so this is just a little bit of how the white consciousness became real. And hopefully this video has given you some extra light to find your way on the path. And I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.